Hong Kong's activists insist it's too little, too late. Nonetheless, the announced withdrawal of the extradition bill that sparked unprecedented mass protests in that former British colony now throws up a dilemma for adversaries of Chief Executive Carrie Lam and her backers in Beijing. They say legislation that would have effectively legalized the sending of political prisoners to the mainland has now since been overshadowed. In particular, they want more guarantees of democracy and demand answers over police brutality. They want an independent inquiry into the authorities' heavy-handed response to what's been a summer of protest. But the leaderless movement faces the risk of protest fatigue, the kind that made the 2014 umbrella movement peter out and lose support among Hong Kong citizens. Then, of course, there's China itself. It's expressed growing impatience over the protests, and events in that territory will no doubt figure high on the agenda next month when an oversight committee of the Communist Party convenes for the first time in more than a year and a half. What's Xi Jinping's next move? How will he act? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking if that extradition bill is too little, too late. And joining us is journalist Ya-Chun Wang. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure to come back.
We want to also thank Xiaowan Shen, graduate student at the American University of Paris. President or chair? Which would you say?
President.
President of the Singapore Students Association in France. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Dorian Malovic, Asia editor for French daily newspaper La Croix.
Yes.
Always a pleasure. And from London, Jasper Becker, the author of Dragon Rising, an inside look at China today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. All or nothing, say protesters who've listed 5 demands. The extradition bill, just one of them, they say. Erna Gunke has more.
It was a necessary but not sufficient condition for protesters in Hong Kong to stop protesting, scrapping the controversial bill that would have allowed extradition to mainland China. That hundreds of school students continued protesting on Thursday indeed suggests the long-awaited decision is not enough. The pro-democracy movement has confirmed demonstrations will continue until all of the movement's demands are met.
If the government is really going to have a sincere dialogue with the protesters, then they should respond to the rest of the demands. And we clearly understand that by having this concession, it doesn't make people get off from the street because they have a strong consensus and commitment to the all 5 demands.
Among their other demands, an independent inquiry into police brutality, amnesty for those arrested during the wave of protests, and universal suffrage. On Thursday, Lam nonetheless expressed hope the bill's withdrawal, along with other planned measures, would end the unrest. She added that the decision was made solely by Hong Kong's government, with support from Beijing.
I have announced a package of 4 actions. So each of those actions requires a process of deliberation, and taken together, I hope that they would provide a basis for a dialogue and help Hong Kong to break the current impasse.
Chinese state media has welcomed the decision, suggesting protesters no longer have any reason to continue. A series of large-scale demonstrations are nonetheless planned for this weekend.
Jasper Becker, the newspaper that you used to work for, the South China Morning Post, quoting sources as saying that this was a decision that did not come from the mainland. Your thoughts on why now this announcement of the withdrawal of the extradition bill?
Yeah, it's hard to figure this out. I mean, I don't think many people really believe that Carrie Lam has the authority or indeed the ambition to make these kind of decisions on her own. One would have to assume that this was decided by the Communist Party in Beijing, and they probably felt that this was a kind of tactical retreat, and that they'd be able to regain the initiative once the protests had died down. Perhaps they considered that using force to crush the protests would be too excessive and too costly. And I think you've got to put this whole thing into a longer-term perspective. I mean, Hong Kong's unique status, all its freedoms, all its aspirations to be a fully fledged functioning democracy are based on the Joint Declaration, which guaranteed these freedoms for 50 years. But that has now coming close to running its course. We've already seen 34 years pass. So China has time on its side. And I think that's what makes this conflict particularly acute, because a lot of people will be thinking in Hong Kong that this is our opportunity to try and make a show of such strong defiance that China will be ready to allow those freedoms to continue, and to sort of deter them from trying to bring Hong Kong fully into the fold of the mainland political system.
Yachon Wang,
Yes.
will this announcement succeed in driving a wedge between the activists in what's been a mostly leaderless movement?
I do not think this means an end to the movement. I think the withdrawal of the extradition bill definitely satisfies a small portion of the protester. Like you said in the beginning, that there were 5 clear demands from the protester, and this is just simply one of them. And I think that I see this as sort of a last resort from the Chinese government. Why did it take so long for the government to even announce the withdrawal of the extradition bill rather than just shelving it? It took almost 2 months and a little bit more. And I think this could be the last resort of China trying to test whether or not this is going to appease the protester just a little bit less than a month before the celebration of 70 years of the Communist Party. And therefore, I think there will be larger clashes in the future.
Last resort, you say. Last resort before what, though?
Before some sort of violence escalate. I'm not suggesting that there will be any sort of military violence, perhaps, but there will be something more intense than the police violence that we've been seeing so far.
And what is the strategy for the activists at this point? What is their top priority?
I think their top priority, it is difficult to tell that whether or not this will end like the umbrella movement in 2014, because it is leaderless, and then there are more technology used to monitor and to gather people this time. And I think there are people, they want to see this as the last chance for them to really restore democracy. And the top demand for them is really to see that Beijing soften their attitude towards people's demand of wanting more democracy and more decision-making on their own.
Xiaowan Chen, you agree?
Well, I agree on the point that I don't think that China would send in, China's People Liberations Army into Hong Kong. One thing that I think is important to note here is that the protest is having an effect on China's global image in terms of its human rights concerns, in terms of what its governance, and especially when we talk about China's and British relations, this has been strained over time. So what essentially Hong Kong is, the reason for the extradition bill is to sort of quell the protests over time, but at the same time give into one of the easiest concessions out of the 5 demands.
Wouldn't the other easiest one be this setting up of an independent inquiry into police brutality?
Yes, I think it's one of the. I think Hong Kong has made significant efforts. I think it has set up sort of a de facto inquiry into looking at the police, the attacks on the police. But at the same time, I think...
De facto?
Well, I wouldn't say de facto, but I'd say that they have looked into it. And there has been sort of an investigation into looking at, for instance, the protesters' attacks on police forces themselves. So the arrest, for instance, of a number of protesters is one key factor we should look at.
Just explain this for us, Dorian Malovic. Why is this issue? Because we had one local journalist tell us on Wednesday that this issue of police brutality has become more important than the extradition bill. Why?
I mean, okay.
We live
I don't
in
want
France
to
where
talk
we're used
yes,
to
I know.
violent
But
demonstrations.
we have to stop about comparing with the Yellow Jacket. I mean, I'm fed up with all the people saying, look at the police in France, what they've done. Let's imagine I lived in Hong Kong in the 80s and I came in the 90s and 2000. The Hong Kong police were one of the best police in Asia. You were safe, they were nice, kind, helpful. The image, I mean, the pictures I saw about the police, I mean, repressing, there is the violence and then there is the repression in the bus, in the subway, in the streets. Like they had carte blanche from the local or Beijing government to quell anything. They arrested people at random. They have now more than 1,000. So that means for Hong Kong people to be the victim of such a local police violence is just unbearable. They cannot imagine now that the police, they don't have ID card anymore. They cannot identify themselves. They are infiltrating the demonstrators. So that means, I mean, the trust they had before with the government, the trust they had before with the police has completely vanished.
But Dorian, there is a parallel that's being drawn with the Yellow Vests, which is that you had this back in June, the biggest demonstration in Hong Kong's history, peaceful.
Yes.
Nothing
2
budged.
million people.
Nothing budged. And so the fact that later we saw the violence with that ransacking of the Executive Council chamber.
1st of July.
That actually violence draws attention and gets results. Because that's what some say is the lesson that Yellow Vests in this country learn.
Yes, but then, I mean, in June, you had the protest for the anti-extradition bill. There was, just the withdrawal, and the people, they wanted, I mean, the law to be completely scrapped. But then nobody answered, and they kept on moving with the fight. The 1st of July, there was the problem at the Lechco, those violence we see. But you had 1 million people in the streets pacifically demonstrating at the same time. But then there was the main first focus on the violence on 1st of July. But then the youngsters, they said, okay, you just compel us to be like violent because nobody wants to listen to us. You don't want to listen to our demands. And 1st of July appeared the 4 other demands apart from the anti-extradition bill. So anti-extradition bill, if the local government or Beijing government think that the withdrawal of this law now can be a kind of way of keeping people down for a while, they completely misread. They are misreading again, I mean, the spirit and the idea behind those demonstrations, you know. It's totally a way of saying, okay, look, there is this propaganda thing. They want to show the world that they made a concession. So now the question is, oh, they made a concession. Why those youngsters are still demonstrating and be violent? So there is no reason, because most of the China propaganda is about the bill. So now they say, okay, they are satisfied with that. They don't speak about the other points.
Jasper Becker, it's been 5 years since the umbrella movement. Just how different, we're almost talking about like it's a different generation now. How different is it this time around?
Yeah, I think it is quite different, and I think it's taken me by surprise, and I imagine it's taken the leadership in Beijing also by surprise. I mean, the fact that this has become so big and has brought out onto the streets such a diverse group of people from all sectors of Hong Kong society. Nobody really expected this kind of defiance. And it is pretty astonishing. I mean, you know, if you consider Hong Kong as part of the whole Chinese world, I mean, nothing really like that has happened since the nationwide pro-democracy protests in 1989. So it is pretty amazing. And I think the reason that it's united people in the middle class as well as the young people against the elite who are so closely tied to Beijing is that this is what many people fear is the last stop. If they
It's a
don't
last
make
hurrah?
the stand now, Hong Kong, Hong Kong will lose its unique status in the Chinese world as the only small enclave of real freedom and democracy, where all the different factions and all the different kinds of actors in the Chinese world have always been allowed to meet and interact, and that's important politically and culturally, but it's also very important economically, because the business interests of Hong Kong, its prosperity is also at stake, because it needs to retain its status as a unique and independent entity. If it becomes seen by the outside world as being absorbed into the mainland political and economic system, then that will threaten, the house prices. It will threaten its status as a trading hub and as a financial hub. So this issue has brought together a lot of different kinds of people who all share a belief that if they are going to guarantee their future, they have to remain outside the Chinese political system, because no one now believes that political system is going to change, is going to democratize any time in the visible future.
We had a recent.
So I think the determination has been astonishing.
We had Yachon Wang, a G7 summit here in France a short while ago. Hong Kong didn't really rate on as a topic of conversation. If you're one of those activists, how do you stop this from being a, quote, noble but lost cause, this battle?
Yeah, I think before the G7, I think if I were one of the protesters, I think the idea of that we're going to be one of the biggest topic in G7 really hyped up. And the result was very disappointing, that actually it was sort of left aside. Nobody really talked about it. They want to talk about trade. They want to talk about economics. They want to talk about the US-China trade war. And I just wanted to add a little bit to what Jasper was saying. And I think that if you look at Hong Kong's economic landscape right now, when Hong Kong returned to China in the 90s, their economic basically counts as 1/5 of the entire Chinese economy. But nowadays, it's less than 5%. They're really losing out on this economic bargain.
They become expendable.
Exactly. And then I think people start to realize that. And at the same time, if you think about it, it has been 22 years now. And then the people who were born around that decade, they're now finally old enough to sort of stand up for what they believe. If you look at the umbrella movement back in 5 years ago, they were still young teenagers. They were still maybe just young adults. But then now that they're in their early 20s, mid-20s, I think they understand the gravity of what they're losing.
And where it might take them. We're going to pick up on that point when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
She's only request a response on us on one, but it's not actually after 3 months and causing a lot of damage, and a lot of people ridiculously arrested by the police.
Situation is not good. Mrs. name is lying, so I think Hong Kong people will more anger. Yes.
Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're wondering where Hong Kong's protest movement goes now that the chief executive has announced the definitive withdrawal of that extradition bill that has sparked a summer of protests. With us to talk about it, journalist Yachon Wang. Welcome back to Zhao and Shen, who's a graduate student at the American University of Paris. Undergraduate.
Yep.
Okay, there you go. And president of the Singapore Students Association in France. Dorian Malovic is the Asia editor for French daily newspaper La Croix. And Jasper Becker, the author of Dragon Rising, an inside look at China today, is with us on the line from London. What is the end game, Dorian Malovic? You've been speaking to a lot of your contacts in Hong Kong, and you and I have talked before about how different activists have different agendas. What is the end game at this point?
No, it's very difficult to say. Actually, the one who can say, okay, it's going to end at the end of September because of October 1st, 70th anniversary of People's Republic of China Foundation. I mean, it would be totally crazy to say that. We cannot tell that. I mean, we have to look at the next steps now. We can imagine it's going to be like protests all over the city and the territory. I mean, the territory is many cities. You just have to remember Hong Kong is not like one city. You had a human chains tonight. You had people in the subway tonight also claiming, to keep on demonstrating. You had the students, the school people, the pupils. So
the fact that last weekend you had protests at the airport for the second time in 3 weeks, do you think that might have been the factor that, or one of the main factors why they decided to pull the extradition bill for good?
Oh, no, I don't think there is any concrete element of what happened the past few days. I mean, this decision of withdrawing is ununderstandable, actually.
Why?
Because it's just like, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't matter at this point. I mean, it's 3 months, nearly 3 months when everything started. I mean, she declared that she wanted to put on a dialogue. I mean, like the violence in Hong Kong is because there was no dialogue. The establishment doesn't understand the people. I mean, you say before, 2 million people, 1.7 million, another 1 million. I mean, you just have to read and listen to those people, for Carrie Lam and the government, to know what they are looking after, what they are looking for. You don't have to put on a dialogue thing. Carrie Lam in 2014 started so-called dialogue with the students at that time. I mean, that was useless. I mean, there was nothing came out of that because there was no concession from Beijing about universal suffrage.
Right.
We cannot expect any other positive points on the other demands, in the future. Though that means, when we say that a police state is starting to settle in Hong Kong, it's the reality. You can imagine, like, you have the train station already where you have the mainland Chinese. You can imagine at the airport, you can imagine mainland Chinese people checking the passport for the flights to mainland. You can have at every subway station the police checking, which is already happening now. So, slowly, the infiltration is just popping up. And I just want to stress that, for 22 years now, you have 150 mainland people allowed to come to settle in Hong Kong. That means you have 800,000 mainlanders settling in Hong Kong, infiltrating.
Infiltrating? Is that too strong?
No, it's not too strong. Okay, you have business
So you're saying Mandarin is superseding Cantonese and...
Yeah, but yes, it's not like I wrote pieces on that a few months ago. They are in the government, administration, bank, insurance, private companies. They are everywhere in the suburb. It's not like... totally paranoid thing, but there are nearly 1 million already. So that means, the swallowing of Hong Kong, the worst part of what's happening now is that it's accelerating the swallowing up of Hong Kong in the mainland system. That's terrible.
Terrible? Xiao Wenchen?
I think, for instance, the protest goes beyond those 5 demands. I think a lot of what my fellow speaker said was basically saying is that the protest basically embodies this anti-Chinese sentiment that has been broiling in Hong Kong over the past couple of decades. So a lot of the issues is that it's not just about democracy, it's not just about universal suffrage, it's about something greater than Hong Kong. It's about the system that's been set up, the one country, two system that's been there for the couple of years now. So it's imperative that we look at this from, for instance, like the perspective of the Chinese government as well. Like, what exactly is Hong Kong to the Chinese government. It's become economically insignificant compared to the second-tier cities of Beijing or Shanghai or Shenzhen.
It's still the world's third biggest trading center.
But the one country, two system.
The world's third
Yeah,
biggest.
but the one country, two system is set up for one particular reason. It's because of Taiwan. And if you look at the relationship between Taiwan and China, if that's been eroding, and it's been sort of, it starts to erode, Hong Kong would not have the one country, two system anymore because it doesn't see any significant reason to sustain it.
All right, Xiaowan, let me ask you, last month, right across the border from Hong Kong, the China People's Armed Police conducted exercises at a sports stadium in Shenzhen. There you see those images. Muscle flexing to express Beijing's, how should we put it, growing impatience. Is the writing on the wall, is it going to end the way it ended in 1989 in Beijing?
It would not be... Tiananmen Square, or what happened in Beijing, was different from what's happening in Hong Kong right now. What you had back then in 1989 was something that happened within Beijing. If you look at the revolutions across Eastern Europe, it all led to the collapse of these communist countries. But now you look at Hong Kong. Hong Kong's in the periphery. It's not necessarily in the capital of that country. It's not within what we so-called the Chinese Empire, essentially. So whether Hong Kong is a significant threat, it doesn't pose any threat at all, in all honesty. That demonstration was simply to scare those protesters, to scare Hong Kongers into conceding.
Jasper Becker, we mentioned at the outset that next month, for the first time in a year and a half, Xi Jinping will be meeting with the steering committee of the Chinese Communist Party. What can we expect?
Well, I think they would allow Carrie Lam to make sufficient concessions so that the street demonstrations would dissipate, would die down. Secondly, I think they would then replace her as soon as possible, and they would draw up a new program to bring Hong Kong under real political control from Beijing, because these protests have obviously made it clear to everyone that what they've been doing over the last 20 or 30 years has been unsuccessful. Although Hong Kong has benefited from the immense prosperity in China, and property prices are sky high, unemployment is very high. It's become very wealthy on the back of mainland Chinese investment and all the opportunities that this has provided. But I think they would draw up a kind of a program similar to the ones that they've implemented in other rebellious regions, such as Tibet or Xinjiang or Inner Mongolia and other places. They would seek to find means to change the makeup of the population and to introduce a much tougher surveillance methods so that they could monitor what people are doing and to punish them. And they would also, I think, strengthen their control over the main economic entities in Hong Kong and try and impose some kind of discipline on Hong Kong. And I think that would mean that some people in Hong Kong will decide they would rather continue their lives abroad, and you would have an influx of a lot more mainlanders into Hong Kong. You would have a much stronger mainland influence over the education system, and so on. So I think they would draw up some kind of program which they hope would work better than the programs that they've used in the past. These kind of patriotic programs using the sort of public sector unions and the schools and so on hasn't obviously done the trick. So I think they're going to sort of reculer pour mieux sauter. They're going to step back a bit and take another leap in a couple of years' time.
All right, China, which is seeing that, as you say, it's lost a bit the PR battle abroad, and in so has repeatedly played up foreign meddling, like at the Daily Foreign Ministry briefing earlier, when a reporter asked about U.S. lawmakers commending the withdrawal of the extradition bill and expressing support for democracy.
I want to reiterate that Hong Kong affairs are purely China's internal affairs and that no external forces have the right to intervene. We urge certain politicians in the US to abide by the international law and basic norms governing international relations, earnestly respect China's sovereignty, immediately stop interfering in Hong Kong's affairs in any form, and immediately stop promoting the review of the relevant proposals on Hong Kong so as to avoid undermining China-US relations and Hong Kong's prosperity and stability.
Dorian Malovic, in mainland China, people accept that explanation, that it is foreign meddling that's to blame?
Well, it's typical CCP propaganda answers. There was the same in '89 about the black hands behind the Tiananmen thing. And they talked last week about the black hands behind the Hong Kong demonstration. But they were black hands Hong Kongers. They were like Martin Lee or Anson Chan, I mean, the locals. But okay, blaming the CIA and the United States, it's totally good for the local domestic propaganda. It
works.
Even though it's very hard to say, to tell. I have a lot of friends in mainland. I mean, we can chat on behind the scenes networks, and they know what's going on in Hong Kong. They know about the demonstration, but the huge majority of people in China are really reddish. I mean, red, especially before the 70th anniversary.
And not only are they red, but state media is calling on young people in the mainland to mobilize against the Hong Kong activists on social media. Among those who've answered the call, so-called fangirls, mostly young women who usually cheer on their favorite celebrities. There's now even Chinese government-sponsored gangsta rap.
In Hong Kong, I start a thing. Who fund you? Who are you? Who's hiding behind the scene? All I see is a beautiful dream turning a nightmare. Can I say hi there? Hong Kong, they all liars. Yeah, I'm talking about American hypocrisy. They know nothing about love, just wars and casualties. And Mrs. Clinton, you know nothing about Chinese citizens. Now I got some words from your president.
Well, something's probably happening with Hong Kong.
Somebody wanna split Hong Kong from us. They started a riot, bring chaos and violence, but this time we stick together.
Well, something's probably happening with Hong Kong.
Any advice, President?
Catchy tune, Yan Chanwang?
Yeah.
I must say it is very, very catchy. And then just to go after what my fellow speaker has been saying, I think that it is very typical what they've been saying. I have been reading what the spokesperson has been saying over the summer since June. The meddling part, it's nothing new. It's not that he just said this today. And the truth is, the Hong Kongese people, they are trying to get international attention.
But what is new, that group, by the way, is called Chengdu Revolution. It is new, isn't it, to call on people to use social media to condone, to have state-sponsored gangster rap in this instance?
I think at this scale, yes, it is something new. And personally, I think it is just another form of propaganda on WeChat, which is the only form of social media that people use to communicate in mainland China. But in a way...
But in fairness, a lot of Chinese citizens are happy to oblige and to take part in this.
How do you measure their willingness, really? How do you measure it? It's just like what my fellow speaker was saying. Nobody is willing to actually respond to, let's say, foreign media's request. Nobody is willing to speak against the government. So everybody who's responding on social media, they're doing it willingly because it appears to be good. It appears to be not opposing to the government. It doesn't do any harm to them. So you can count on them doing that because it doesn't do any harm. But are they really willing to do it? I don't think you can measure that.
I think I disagree on some points of of her argument. I think particularly when it comes to the Hong Kong issue, we have to look at this from two perspectives. One is Hong Kong and one is in China, mainland China particularly. The Chinese model, as we know it, prioritize economic rights over human rights. So over time, I think these people look at Hong Kong as sort of the failure of democracy in China. And it looks at, for instance, the anti-Chinese sentiment. It looks at, the violence that has occurred in Hong Kong. And I think a significant part of it is, of course, propaganda, and that's played by the Chinese central government. But I think at the same time, a lot of Chinese citizens on the mainland believe that what is happening in Hong Kong is unacceptable.
That clip we heard, it's in English. Is it aimed at an international audience, at a foreign audience, or is it aimed at the Chinese?
I think it's aimed at, a mixture of both as well. I mean, on that.
And how effective do you think that is?
I think it's not as effective as it is, but if you look at the propaganda department of China, it's huge. I mean, last month or so, I think Twitter shut down 20,000 accounts belonging to the Chinese State Department. So essentially what this is targeting how people perceive the world's perception of the Hong Kong issue, but also targeting people's perspective on the mainland. So it's sort of a two-way campaign in which they're targeting at both parties.
Yeah, and just sort of to respond what you're saying, and you have to understand that people in mainland China, they are not getting the same news. Yeah. They're not getting the same sources of information as people in Hong Kong. They have complete different understanding of what they want and what the other parts want. Hong Kongese people, they grew up with this idea of democracy. They want to keep it. And the Chinese people, they never had it. How would you expect them to understand this is something so essential for Hong Kongese people? And then therefore, if the government is putting out something, and all I've been reading on Xinhua News, on the local news, it's all that they're riotous. They're hitting the police. They're discriminating the police. They're saying that we're doing something wrong. But look at them. They're the one hitting people. They're the one that making our faithful policemen bleed. So,
not within China. Within China itself, yeah, but abroad, is Beijing getting better at getting its message across?
That's interesting, because when we looked at all the demonstration for pro-Hong Kong people, the diaspora of Hong Kong demonstrated in Australia, in Europe, in the States, for Hong Kong, you had counter-protesters, pro-Beijing counter-protesters, very well organized by the local Chinese consulate or Chinese embassies or Chinese student association. They had very huge flags, and they were just shouting aggressively against those young pro-Hong Kong people. And funny enough, last week I was at another demonstration here in Paris, La République, and there was not even one pro-Beijing counter-protester. So that means in 2 weeks, maybe they realized that those counter-demonstrators was counterproductive for the image of China, because they were paid to shout and to sing the national Chinese anthem against the Hong Kong people. And so the image was not so good. And I think internationally, even though not even one country would do something for Hong Kong in the future.
But we've seen, for instance, in the case of Russia, that a lot of people here in France watch the French version of Russia Today, and they'll go online to see the Russian news sites that are in French. The Chinese also have outlets in French.
Yes, but
do they get their message across to ordinary citizens?
I'm not sure at all. I mean, you remember, in a long-term perspective, from the past, Tibetans, now it's over. Xinjiang, 2 million people in camps, right? People in France, they know that now. They discovered now that Beijing and China for more than 20 years just made up everything and just betrayed us on this so-called economic evolution that would lead mainland China to a more liberal political system. And what we can see with Xi Jinping since 2012 is totally contrary to that. And the repression and totalitarian regime is even stronger now than it was 10 years ago. So, the image...
But some in France look at the economic success.
Yeah, but the price of it, is not...
They see both, you're saying?
Yes.
We'll have to leave it there, unfortunately. Dorian Malevich, I want to thank you. I want to thank Xiaowan Shen. I want to thank Yachun Wang. Jasper Becker for being with us from London. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Yenna Lee.
Hi, Francois.
So, Carrie Lam, but we heard in Jasper Becker saying her days may be numbered.
Indeed, indeed. Well, Carrie Lam reiterated her desire today in a press conference that Hong Kongers move on from all this havoc and all this unrest. But it just doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. Trending on Twitter today and yesterday is the hashtag 5 demands, not one less, with graphics such as these that reiterate, really spell out the 5 demands in both Chinese and in English. Here's one, and here's another one. You see here, we've seen them no extradition. That's the law that has been repealed, but the other suggestions as well. Here, there's another one that really focuses on the fact that they want to choose their own chief executive. Hong Kong's leader is selected by a select committee chosen by Beijing, and protesters want to directly vote for the leader themselves. Many of the poster art we see on Twitter, such as this, focusing again on the 5 major demands, or this. These are images that are actually...
Sorry, go back to the previous one there.
The 5 demands.
Is this in... Because I don't... is this Mandarin or is this Cantonese?
It's written the same way. It's Chinese.
It's...
Yeah.
It's...
Oh, yeah, they're all the same thing.
It's all the same.
Okay. No, but...
It's the design is different.
Trust us.
All right.
Indeed, indeed. And moving on, another image of today of the students who are protesting. We are Hong Kongers together. We are one. Many of this art is actually already circulating on an app called Telegram. It's at a messaging platform, and there's over 100 groups dedicated just to organising the protests, the Hong Kong protests on it, where people decide where to meet, what they're going to do, what's the order of the day, and that's where they've been sharing information and organising things. In July, the app garnered 110,000 new users in Hong Kong alone. It really shows that it's a leaderless movement, it's a grassroots movement, where people really rely on effective communication to continue these marches. Here, one person's created this crowdsourced map. Oh, it's a pity you can't see it very clearly here because of the lack of quality in the screen. But basically, users can add information of where there are police, riot police, where there's a first
So kind of a
aid
ways
station.
for protesters, basically?
Exactly, and warning signs.
everywhere.
And it's changing in real time. You can see the time in the corner there. Anyone can participate and update it. It's really a very creative way, I guess, for the protesters who are, at least on the internet and on Twitter, are very likely to continue to keep the movement alive. Like these are images from this evening in a neighbourhood called Tin Shui Wai, where there are protesters doing a human chain with schoolgirls and children, very young children, participating. Meanwhile, Chinese state media, of course, focusing on the disruption. That's their angle, the damage that's been caused during these protests. Pro-Beijing users are obviously, they exist too on Twitter. They're focusing their support for the Hong Kong police. What's interesting as well this Thursday is that the Hong Kong's government has paid for a full-page ad in today's Australian Financial Times review. It's targeting businesses, basically, to reassure them and reassure investors that it's all going to be fine in Hong Kong. Louisa Lim saying, looks like Hong Kong government is copying the protesters' methods. And this user also saying, we crowdfunded our international adverts. Who paid for this one? Implying that, of course, it's taxpayers' money paying for these international ads. Both users referring to ads such as this that appeared in The Economist. Again, a full-page ad, this time from the protesters' side last week. You can't see very clearly, but it does read, this is an urgent appeal from Hong Kong. The clock is ticking. We need your help.
All right, many thanks for that, Yenna Lee. This battle playing out over social media and traditional media. Many thanks. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.